My name is Patricia Pulham, and I'm reading in Victorian Literature at the University of Portsmouth. My own kind of interest in this particular field of research comes out of my PhD thesis, which was on the supernatural tales of Vernon, and also more recently I worked with Christine Ferguson on a collection of spiritualism, 18. Can I do that one again?
Yes. Shall we start that one again?
Well, that's fine, we can edit it out.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, you can edit it out.
Start from the top, yeah.
Right, so what from my name is...
Oh, well, I'm sure we can cut it.
Yeah, we can cut. You can just carry on.
Yeah.
So my interest in this particular field of research stems from my work on Vernon. I wrote my thesis on her supernatural fiction, and more recently I worked on a 4-volume collection on spiritualism, 1840 to 1930, and wrote a volume for that on spiritualism in literature. I'm also in the process of creating a new undergraduate unit on the occult, so it's going to inform my teaching as well.
Great. You've talked a bit there about how I think you became interested in the popular occult, so we'll move on to the next question, which is really about the scheme that we're operating within here through the HRC. The networking scheme is focused on this concept of breaking boundaries, and you're interested in how that speaks to the occult. So how do you think that the occult breaks down boundaries between different kinds of people, beliefs, or forms of culture in the period that we're looking at?
Well, I think this particular period is fascinating for this kind of idea of breaking boundaries, because it works particularly in terms of gender and sexuality. The occult's usually, or quite often, used to express the inexpressible. So it certainly uses gender and sexuality as a kind of background to the occult. But also in terms of literary genres. So, for example, sometimes you find crossovers between naturalism, the Gothic, detective fiction, even comedy at times. And I think that's kind of fascinating in itself, that it has a kind of the boundaries in terms of the literary boundaries crossed continually in this kind of literature. And of course then that makes it accessible to a very wide readership, and particularly given that during this period the literacy was increasing, and that there was a much wider audience for this and readership for this kind of work. So you can see that there's something to appeal to everybody in popular culture.
And the talk you're giving tomorrow about Richard Marsh is very much a writer who breaks those boundaries that you're talking about.
Absolutely, and in fact I'm going to talk about the Goddess, one of Richard Marsh's novels from 1900, and that in particular does use the naturalism and the Gothic as kind of melded modes. But also what I really find interesting is the way that there are questions of technology, psychology, and those are also blurred as well in this particular text. So I'm looking forward to talking about that.
Great. So our project has a title which might seem slightly contradictory. It's about the popular occult, two things that, depending on how you define the occult, if you think it's arcane and secret, don't go together. But do you think the occult can really be popular? Are those two things compatible?
I think that particularly in the late 20th and 21st century we've seen that coming through. So you have things like Twilight, American Gothic. But what I think is fascinating about the period that we're looking at is that many of the people who watch those kinds of programs don't actually know the prehistory of that in the late Victorian and early part of the 20th century. So I think that that's what this project brings. It gives a prehistory to what is conceived of as popular occult culture now. What we want to say is that popular occult culture has existed for a very long time, and it had the same kind of effect on the readership and audiences at the time as it's perhaps having now.
Terrific. In your research, obviously you've worked on Vernon Lee's Gothic fiction. Right now you're working on some late Victorian popular texts that deal with occult themes and topics. Are there any particular kinds of archives or resources that you found really key to your understanding of the occult or the popular occult?
Well, I think good starting points are, for example, the Ashgate Research Companion to Spiritualism and the Occult, which gives you a kind of wide-ranging understanding of the different kinds of occult materials that were being engaged with during the period that we're looking at. But also there's something like Christopher Partridge's The Re-Enchantment of the West, which I think again gives you an idea of how questions of Orientalism also fed into popular occulture in the West, and how sometimes the West was using kind of Eastern modes of the occult, and or informed by Eastern modes of the occult to produce its popular occulture. But I think also in terms of more specific archives, I think there's a very underworked archive, a Conan Doyle archive in Portsmouth City Library, which has fantastic materials in terms of spirit photography and also people's popular engagement with Conan Doyle and spiritualism. There are numerous letters, there are also examples of automatic writing, so I think that archive is something that people could draw on that perhaps they haven't had a chance to as yet.
Great. Terrific. Okay, and the final question is, why the occult now? What is the reason for studying it now at this particular time, and what do you think the place of material like this has in the university?
Well, I think it intersects with so many different aspects of the kinds of things that we study, and one example of that would be, for example, the eco-Gothic. There's a growing interest in the environment, there's a growing interest in eco-criticism, and I think that the occult brings something really interesting to that, because particularly, for example, in the work of Arthur Machen or Algernon Blackwood, you have this psychic as well as physical engagement with the environment, and the boundaries are constantly blurred between psychic and physical experiences. And I think that for students to study that kind of material would give them a whole new perspective on ecological concerns.
Great.
Right, thank you.
Thanks very much.